Hello and welcome to a very special week on English Plus Podcast. Have you ever made a choice and later wondered, why on earth did I do that? Have you ever been absolutely certain about a memory only to find out you were completely wrong? Or have you ever found yourself agreeing with a group even when your gut was screaming at you to object? If you've answered yes to any of these, then you are, in a word, human. Our brains are the most powerful tools in the known universe, capable of composing symphonies, designing skyscrapers, and contemplating the very nature of reality. But they are not perfect. To navigate the overwhelming complexity of the world, our minds have developed a set of mental shortcuts, invisible scripts that run in the background of our thoughts, helping us to make sense of everything quickly and efficiently. These shortcuts are called cognitive biases. Welcome to a new episode from English Plus Podcast. This week, we are embarking on a 5-day journey deep into the architecture of your own mind. From Monday to Friday, we will release a new episode dedicated to uncovering these hidden forces. We'll explore the predictable, systematic errors in our thinking that shape every aspect of our lives, from the products we buy to the beliefs we hold, the way we see ourselves, and even the memories that define who we are. Each day, we'll start with a story, a relatable, everyday scenario where these biases are secretly pulling the strings. Then we'll dive into the fascinating science behind it all, exploring the classic experiments and profound insights that have revolutionized our understanding of human psychology. And because this is English Plus Podcast, each episode will end with a dedicated language-focused section. We'll arm you with the sophisticated vocabulary and grammar to discuss these complex ideas. We're going to practice a real-world speaking skill to help you navigate your life more thoughtfully and give you a writing challenge to apply what you've learned. So get ready, my friends. By the end of this week, you'll have a user manual for the human brain. You'll start to see these biases everywhere, in the news, at your job, in your friends, and most importantly, in the mirror. This isn't about finding flaws, it's about gaining wisdom. And now let me tell you quickly about the 5 episodes we're going to talk about this week, and the main topic we're going to discuss in each of those episodes. In our episode today, we're going to talk the biases of decision-making and judgment. Tomorrow, we will talk about the biases of belief and interpretation. In our 3rd episode of this week, we're going to talk about the biases of self-perception and abilities. Our 4th episode is going to be about the biases of social and group dynamics. And the final episode in our theme for this week is going to be about the biases of memory and recall. Now, before we move on to today's episode, let me tell you that this episode is completely free. You're going to listen to the entire episode for free so that you can sample what we do here in English Plus Podcast. And for the rest of the week, you're also going to listen to most of the episode for free, but I'm just going to dedicate the language-focused section of each episode to my subscribers on Apple Podcasts or Patreon. And let me tell you about one more thing. This week is about understanding cognitive biases not only on the podcast. I'm doing the same thing on the website as well. If you go to the website, EnglishPlusPodcast.com, you'll find that a lot of our articles this week are about understanding cognitive biases, including magazine articles, learning quizzes, and our focus on listening and reading posts on the website. So make sure you check them out as well. And now, without further ado, let's start our very first episode for this week in our major topic, understanding cognitive biases, and today is all about the biases of decision-making and judgment. That's what we're going to talk about next. Don't go anywhere. I'll be right back. Do you ever feel like you're on autopilot when you make choices? Have you ever bought something and later wondered why? This week, we begin our journey into the hidden world of cognitive biases, exploring the invisible scripts that guide your decisions every day. We'll find out why the first price you see is so powerful, why we stick with bad decisions, and how focusing only on success stories can lead us astray. Are your choices really your own? Let's find out. And we're going to start with a very short story about Sarah's perfect trip. Let's enjoy the story first, and then we're going to learn from it. For weeks, Sarah had felt adrift in a sea of gray, monotonous workdays. Her life felt like a series of identical beige cubicles and spreadsheets that blurred into one another. She yearned for an escape, a splash of vibrant color in her life. But the world is a vast book, and she couldn't decide which page to turn to. That was until last Tuesday. Curled up on her sofa, aimlessly scrolling through streaming services, she stumbled upon a documentary. It wasn't just a film, it was a portal. For an hour, her drab living room dissolved, replaced by a cascade of emerald green rainforests and sapphire blue oceans. She could almost feel the humid air on her skin as she heard the primal call of a howler monkey and saw a symphony of scarlet macaws paint the sky. The documentary was about Costa Rica, and by the time the credits rolled, the country's name had etched itself onto her imagination. All other destinations faded into the background. It was no longer a choice. It was a calling, a vivid, easily recalled solution to her colorless life. Energized, Sarah dove into planning. Her first search yielded a dazzling Pura Vida package tour for $2,500. The website was a masterpiece of persuasion, with glossy photos of ziplining over cloud forests and testimonials from blissfully happy travelers. The pride made her wince. It was a little steeper than she'd hoped, but the images were intoxicating. That number, $2,500, became a benchmark, an anchor dropped deep into the waters of her mind. She spent the next day hunting for alternatives, determined to be a savvy consumer. She found a different tour, highly recommended on a travel forum, for just $2,000. Rationally, it was the superior choice. It included an extra day and a visit to a sloth sanctuary she dreamed of. Yet it felt wrong. Her mind immediately began to justify her initial preference. "You get what you pay for," she muttered to herself. The cheaper tour seemed budget, somehow less authentic than the first, more expensive option. She couldn't shake the feeling that the $2,500 tour was the real price for a trip of that caliber, the one against which all others should be judged and found wanting. With her decision made, she found a non-refundable flight for $300 and booked it with a triumphant click. The commitment felt good, a decisive step out of her rut. That is, until the email arrived a week later. Its subject line a burst of celebratory emojis. Her best friend Chloe was getting married on the exact weekend of her planned departure. Sarah's heart sank. This wasn't just any wedding, it was an intimate, once-in-a-lifetime event for the friend she'd known since childhood. But the thought of that $300 vanishing into thin air was a sharp, nagging pain, a concrete loss she could quantify. "I can't just throw that money away," she reasoned with herself, the logic feeling sound and responsible. Chloe would understand. A wedding is just one day, but this trip, this was an investment in her well-being. She had already put money down. To back out now would be to admit a mistake, a waste. She stuck with the trip. Next, the hotel. Overwhelmed by a dizzying array of boutique eco-lodges and charming local inns, each with conflicting reviews and a dizzying number of options, Sarah felt a familiar paralysis creep in. Her browser groaned under the weight of 20 open tabs. She sighed and navigated to the website of the Global Voyager, the same international hotel chain she always used for business trips. It wasn't the most exciting, nor the cheapest, but it was a known quantity. The booking process was familiar, the rooms predictable. It was just easier than venturing into the unknown, a comfortable refuge from the cognitive effort of making another new decision. For the final touch, she needed a local guide for a rainforest hike. She found a website listing dozens of local operators. Many had vanished, their links dead, digital ghosts of failed businesses. A handful remained, all boasting glowing 5-star reviews. She chose Jungle Huan's Journeys. Impressed by the unanimous praise, the quality of guides here must be incredible, she thought, marveling at the perfect scores. It never occurred to her that she was only seeing the success stories, the businesses that had survived long enough to accumulate positive feedback. The countless others that might have failed due to poor service or bad experiences had simply disappeared, their 1-star warnings erased from the internet's memory, leaving behind a distorted, overly optimistic picture of reality. Leaning back from her screen, a mosaic of confirmations and receipts opened before her. Sarah felt a deep sense of satisfaction. She felt savvy, in control, a master planner who had conquered the chaos of travel booking. She had researched, budgeted, and planned the perfect, rational escape. But from the initial spark of inspiration to the final booking, her dream trip had been quietly and masterfully designed not by her, but by the invisible architects of her own mind. Alright, my friends, now we're back after this story. Well, this story is a typical story that might have happened to you or might have happened to someone you know about. But let's get back to our friend Sarah. Now, she thinks she's just planned the perfect, rational, well-thought-out vacation to Costa Rica. And from the outside, it looks like it. She did her research, she made her bookings, but as we saw, her brain was playing a few tricks on her. Her decision-making process was less like a straight line and more like a pinball machine bouncing off a series of powerful but invisible bumpers called cognitive biases. These aren't flaws, exactly. They're mental shortcuts or heuristics that our brain have developed over millennia to help us think quickly and efficiently. But sometimes, in our modern world, these shortcuts lead us down some very strange and irrational paths. Sarah's story was a perfect storm of 5 of the most common and powerful decision-making biases. So let's break them down one by one. First of all, let's start with the availability heuristic, the tyranny of the top of mind. Now, let's start at the beginning. That documentary. Before Sarah watched it, the entire world was an option. Afterward, Costa Rica was the only option. Why? Because of the availability heuristic. This is the tendency to use whatever information is the most available to us to make decisions. Our brain has a simple rule of thumb. If we can recall something easily, it must be important and, therefore, more common or likely than things that are harder to recall. The documentary, with its thrilling music and stunning high-definition visuals of toucans and turquoise waters, made the idea of Costa Rican vacation incredibly vivid and easy to access in her mind. All other potential destinations, Italy, Japan, Thailand, for example, became fuzzy, abstract concepts that would have required more mental effort to explore. The recent, emotional, and vivid information won. It was simply more available. Now you see this play out in your own life all the time, especially when it comes to fear. Now think about the news. We are constantly bombarded with stories about plane crashes, shark attacks, and lottery winners. These events are, statistically speaking, incredibly rare. But because they are so dramatic and heavily reported, they become seared into our minds. They become highly available. This is why, after the tragic events of 9/11, nearly half of Americans reported being less willing to fly, even though flying is statistically the safest form of travel by a massive margin. In 2019, for example, there were fewer than 500 plane accidents compared to over 36,000 deaths from car accidents in the United States alone. But you don't see a dramatic news report every time there's a car crash. It's too common. The rarity of a plane crash is what makes it newsworthy, and that newsworthiness is what makes it stick in our heads, biasing our perception of risk. It's not just about big, scary things either. Psychologists Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman, the godfathers of this field, demonstrated this with a simple puzzle. Let me ask you, if you pick a random word from an English text, is it more likely that the word starts with the letter R, or that R is the third letter? Now, most people immediately say it's more likely to start with R. Why? Because your brain's search function is optimized for beginnings. It's incredibly easy to think of words that start with R. Rabbit, run, ridiculous, rationalize, etc. But it's much harder to dredge up words where R is the third letter, like park, bird, word, surge, etc. But in reality, there are more than twice as many words with R in the third position as there are words to start with it. It's just that the words starting with R are more mentally available. So the next time you have a gut feeling about something, ask yourself, is this feeling based on facts, or is it just the first thing my brain could find in its messy filing cabinet? So, my friends, that is about the availability heuristic. But that's not everything. We also have the anchoring bias, the power of the first number. Now, let's get back to the story. Now, Sarah has settled on Costa Rica, right? Next, she sees that first tour package, $2,500. She winced, but it was too late. That number was now the star of the show, the main character in her vacation planning story. This is what we call the anchoring bias. This is our tendency to rely heavily, almost obsessively, on the very first piece of information we're given when making a decision. That first piece of information, the anchor, becomes the reference point for all future judgments. And we adjust from there. The problem is, we don't adjust nearly enough. Sarah's brain was now tethered to that $2,500 figure. So when she saw the better, cheaper tour for $2,000, her brain didn't see it as a fantastic deal. It saw it as a $500 deviation from the real price. The anchor made the objectively better option feel cheap and suspicious. This bias is one of the most robust and widely used in the world, especially in negotiations. It's why a car dealership puts a high sticker price on the window. They know that number will anchor your perception of the car's value. Every dollar they generously knock off feels like a win for you, even if the final price is still well above what they're actually willing to sell it for. The research on this is clear. In a negotiation, you should almost always try to be the first to make an offer. By doing so, you get to set the anchor. One study by psychologists Adam Galinsky and Thomas Musweiler found that when a buyer made the first offer in a negotiation for a factory, the final sale price was, on average, millions of dollars lower than when the seller made the first offer. The first number thrown out there defined the entire playing field. And again, just like the availability heuristic, it's not just about money. Kahneman and Tversky once asked two groups of people to quickly estimate the answer to a math problem in 5 seconds. Group 1 saw 8 multiplied by 7, then by 6, then by 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And Group 2 saw 1 multiplied by 2, then 3, and 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. Now, logically, the answer is the same. But the group's estimates were widely different. The group that saw the 8 first gave a median estimate of 2,250. The group that saw the 1 first gave a median estimate of just 512. The real answer, by the way, is 40,320. Both groups were way off, but the group anchored to a higher number produced a much higher estimate. That first piece of information, however arbitrary, frames the entire subsequent thought process. So, that was about the anchoring bias, my friends, but that's not everything. We still have a couple more biases we're going to talk about in this episode. Next, let's talk about the sunk cost fallacy, a very important one, and that's the folly of too much to quit. And now we get to the most painful part of Sarah's story, the wedding. Now, she is faced with a clear choice between a $300 financial loss and missing her best friend's wedding. She chooses to miss the wedding. Now, this isn't because she's a bad friend. It's because she fell headfirst into the sunk cost fallacy. This bias, also known as escalation of commitment, is our tendency to continue with a course of action not because it's the best choice for our future, but because we've already invested time, money, or effort into it that we can't get back. That non-refundable $300 flight is the sunk cost. It's gone no matter what she does. The only rational way forward is to ask, forgetting what I've already spent, what is the best choice for me right now? Now, the best choice was obviously the wedding. I don't know, it's just a story, but usually people would drop the $300 and go to the wedding, obviously. But I wrote this in the story just to make a point, to show you that her brain wasn't focused on the future gain of a cherished memory, it was fixated on the past loss of $300. Now, we hate losing things, especially money, and we will often make an even worse decision just to avoid the feeling of having wasted something. Now, we do this all the time. Have you ever forced yourself to finish a terrible movie just because you paid for the ticket? Or kept watching a TV series that got awful 3 seasons ago because you've already come this far? That's the sunk cost fallacy. You're not getting that time or money back. Your future self would be better off if you just cut your losses and did something you actually enjoy. But the ghost of past investment haunts us. This can escalate into a massive scale. There's the incredible example of the Berlin-Brandenburg Airport project. Construction began in 2006. By 2012, just a month before it was supposed to open, massive technical problems were found. The project was plagued by delays, bankruptcies, and corruption allegations. Now, logically, they could have cut their losses and upgraded the existing functional airport. But they had already sunk billions of euros into the new one. So they kept going. Year after year, they throw more good money after bad. The airport finally opened in 2020, 14 years after construction began, and vastly over budget. This is a textbook multi-billion-dollar example of the sunk cost fallacy. So my friends, whether it's a $300 flight or a billion-dollar airport, the psychological mechanism is the same. Our aversion to waste makes us waste even more. So that was about the sunk cost fallacy. Next, let's talk about the status quo bias, the comfort of same old, same old. Now, when it came time to book her hotel, Sarah was overwhelmed. So she retreated to the familiar, the comfortable, the same old, same old. She chose the hotel chain she always uses, not because it was the best, but because it was the easiest. Well, this is the status quo bias. Now, the status quo bias is our deep-seated preference for the current state of affairs. Our brain treats our current situation as a baseline, and any change from that baseline, even a positive one, is perceived as a potential risk or loss. It requires mental energy to evaluate new options, and it opens us up to the possibility of regret if we make the wrong choice. So often, the easiest path is to do, well, nothing. Just stick with the default. Well, this is a subtle but incredibly powerful force in our lives. It's why we stick with the same brand of cereal, the same route to work, or the same default apps that came with our phone, even if better alternatives exist. The effort required to change often feels greater than the potential benefit. Economists William Samuelson and Richard Zeckhauser, who coined the term, demonstrated this with an investment experiment. When participants were given a cash inheritance and asked to invest it, they spread their money across different options. But when they were given an inheritance that was already invested in one specific fund, a huge majority chose to just leave it there, to stick with the status quo, even when presented with identical alternatives. The pre-existing situation felt like the correct one. Well, this bias has huge implications for everything from public policy to our own well-being. It's why opt-out programs are so much more effective than opt-in programs. In countries where citizens are automatically enrolled as organ donors by default, the status quo, and have to actively choose to opt out, donation rates are over 90%. In countries where you have to actively choose to opt in, the rates are often below 20%. The bias toward the default, the status quo, literally saves lives. In this case, of course, but in other cases, it might be dangerous. Now, for Sarah, it just meant a predictable, unexciting hotel room. But it shows how that pull towards the familiar is a constant, quiet force in our lives. I'm not saying it's bad. And by the way, none of the biases we're going to talk about in this whole 5-day series of episodes is going to be bad. They're just shortcuts, as I told you. It's an inheritance we have from some survival mechanisms that we developed over millennia. And it worked all that time, and it still works, and still good, but sometimes, that's what we're trying to focus on in the series, sometimes these shortcuts can lead to places that you don't want to go to. And that's why we're talking about them. We need to know about them. And maybe the main goal from all the series is to be able to know whether this is what we want, what we really want, or we're choosing something just because we're under the influence of some bias, some cognitive bias. So, my friends, that was about the status quo bias. And now for the last bias we're going to talk about in today's episode, this is going to be the survivorship bias, the danger of seeing only the winners. Now, at the end of the story, we have Sarah trying to choose a tour guide. Now, she picked Jungle Huan's Journeys because it had perfect 5-star reviews. Now, she thought, wow, the guides here are amazing. What she didn't see were the digital ghosts of Trekking Tom's Trips and Canopy Carla's Canyons, companies that went out of business after a string of 1-star reviews about getting lost in the jungle. She was a victim of survivorship bias. This is the logical error of focusing on the people or things that survived, some selection process, while completely overlooking those that did not, usually because the failures are not longer visible. The result is that we get a skewed, overly optimistic view of reality. We see the college dropouts who became billionaires like Bill Gates and Mark Zuckerberg and think it might be a viable path to success. We ignore the millions of other college dropouts who did not become billionaires because their stories aren't told. We hear that cats always land on their feet because the only cats we can ask are the ones that, well, survived the fall. The most famous example of overcoming this bias comes from World War II. The US military wanted to add armor to their planes to make them safer. To figure out where to put the armor, they looked at the planes that came back from missions and mapped out the bullet holes. The initial conclusion was to reinforce the areas that were most frequently hit: the wings, the tail, and the main body. But a brilliant statistician named Abraham Wold looked at the same data and came to the exact opposite conclusion. He argued that the military should put armor where the bullet holes weren't, on the engine and the cockpit. His reasoning was profound. The planes they were studying were the survivors. The fact that they had returned with bullet holes in the wings and tail meant that those areas could take damage. The planes that were hit in the engine or the cockpit were the ones that never came back. They weren't there to be studied. By focusing on the non-survivors, Wald correctly identified the plane's true vulnerabilities, a lesson that undoubtedly saved many lives. For Sarah, this bias just led her to an incomplete picture of the tour guide market. But in life, as in war, ignoring the silent evidence of failure can be a catastrophic mistake. So, my friends, these are the 5 biases that I want to talk about in this episode when it comes to decision making. We talked about the availability heuristic, we talked about the anchoring bias, we talked about the sunk cost fallacy, the status quo bias, and finally, the survivorship bias. Now, of course, I hope that you learned something new, but I really hope that you learned something that is useful, something that you can use in your everyday life. I mean, yeah, of course, it's really nice to learn new things. This lifelong learning thing is beautiful. And if you enjoy learning about new things like I do, and sometimes for no good reason, which is fine, by the way, that's my type of entertainment. But what I'm trying to do here is not just to create entertainment, which I hope I create, but also something useful to your everyday life. I hope you learned something new, but now it's time for us to move to our language focus section. That's coming next. Don't go anywhere. I'll be right back. Welcome back, my friends, to the language focus section of our English Plus podcast episodes. In the first part of our show, we explored the fascinating and sometimes frustrating world of decision-making biases. We learned how our brains take shortcuts that can lead us to some pretty irrational choices. But understanding these concepts is one thing, and talking about them is another. How do you discuss these ideas in English with clarity and confidence? That's what this section is all about. I'm going to arm you with the essential vocabulary, a powerful grammar structure for talking about past mistakes, a practical speaking skill to help you in your daily life, and a writing challenge to put it all into practice. Let's dive in, and let's start with the vocabulary, the language of decision making. Now, first up, let's look at some of the key words we use today. These are fantastic, high-level terms that will make you sound incredibly intelligent when you discuss psychology, business, or just everyday life. Now, let's start with heuristic. And by the way, this is spelled Heuristic. Heuristic. Now, a heuristic is a mental shortcut that allows people to quickly make judgments and solve problems. Think of it as a rule of thumb. Heuristics are fast, but as we've seen, they're not always perfect. The availability heuristic is a prime example. For example, we can say instead of analyzing every single car on the market, many people use a simple heuristic. They just buy the same brand their parents drove. Another example, the availability heuristic is a useful mental shortcut, but it often leads us to misjudge risks in the modern world. All right? So that was about heuristic, my friends, a very interesting word that you can use. But next, let's move on to another word, and this one is anchor. 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 Now, in the context of psychology, an anchor is the first piece of information you receive that serves as a reference point for all your future decisions. It's the starting point from which you adjust your thinking. For example, the salesman mentioned the high retail price to set an anchor in my mind, making the final price seem like a great deal. In our story, the $2,500 tour package acted as an anchor, which made all other options seem cheap in comparison. That was about our second word, anchor. Next, let's talk about to justify. 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 Now, to justify something means to show or prove that it is right, reasonable, or necessary. When we make a biased decision, we often spend a lot of mental energy trying to justify it to ourselves and others. For example, Sarah tried to justify missing the wedding by telling herself the trip was a necessary investment in her well-being. Another example, it's difficult to justify spending so much money on a failing project, but the sunk cost fallacy makes us do it all the time. Now, here let me tell you about the noun that is related to justify, and this is justification. For example, his justification for being late didn't seem very convincing. All right, so that is another very useful word that we can use to justify. Next, let's talk about status quo. Statusquo. Status quo. Now, status quo is a Latin phrase that means the existing state of affairs, especially regarding social or political issues. It refers to the way things are right now. The status quo bias is our preference for keeping things exactly as they are. That's why many people are resistant to change, right? For example, we can say many people are resistant to new technology because they are comfortable with the status quo. Another example, the company's leadership was afraid to challenge the status quo even though their sales were declining. And here, talking about the status quo, I need to tell you about a common phrase people use all the time, and that is to maintain the status quo. To keep the status quo as it is. To maintain the status quo. All right? Next, let's move on to another word, and this one is a very useful verb, to overestimate. Overestimate. To overestimate. Now, to overestimate means to estimate something to be larger or greater than it actually is. Now, cognitive biases often cause us to overestimate our chances of success or underestimate risks. Here, I used underestimate, which is obviously the opposite of overestimate. Let me give you a couple of examples. Because of the availability heuristic, we tend to overestimate the likelihood of rare but dramatic events like shark attacks. Another example, she seriously overestimated her ability to finish the project in 1 week. Now, as I told you earlier, the antonym or the opposite is to underestimate. For example, don't underestimate your opponent. She's very skilled. Okay, that was about overestimate, my friends. Next, let's talk about escalate, to escalate. This one is a very interesting, very important verb that you need to learn about. Escalate, to escalate. Now, to escalate means to increase rapidly or become more intense or serious. Now, the sunk cost fallacy is often called escalation of commitment because it describes how we let our commitment to a failing project escalate over time. For example, we can say, what started as a small disagreement quickly escalated into a full-blown argument. Or another example, his financial commitment to the business continued to escalate long after it was clear the company would fail. Now here, escalate is the verb, the noun is escalation. Like when we say the escalation of the conflict was a concern for everyone. That's why you hear it in the news all the time that they're trying to de-escalate the situation. De-escalate, that's the opposite of escalate, right? So we got a fantastic word here that we can use in our everyday life, right? To escalate. And now we come to one of my favorite words, inevitable. I-N-E-V-I-T-A-B-L-E. Inevitable. Now, something that is inevitable is certain to happen and cannot be prevented or avoided. Now, sometimes we use our biases to convince ourselves that a negative outcome was inevitable, which helps us feel better about it. For example, after seeing the dark clouds, the thunderstorm felt inevitable. Or, another example, many people feel that change is difficult, but in a growing company, it is inevitable. There you have it, my friends. 7 fantastic words that you can use in your everyday life. You can start right now. Trust me, if you don't use them, you'll lose them. So try to use 1 or 2 of them this week. You'll be surprised at how often they fit into conversations. So that's it for our vocabulary section. Next, let's move on to our grammar section. We're going to talk about the third conditional, the language of regret and reflection. That's coming next. Don't go anywhere. I'll be right back. All right, my friends, we're back for the third conditional, language of regret and reflection in our grammar section for today. Now, have you ever looked back on a decision and thought, oh, if I only had known, or if I had done that differently, everything would have changed? Of course you have. We all do. Now, we're not going to talk about regret and its psychological effect or anything. We're going to talk about the grammatical structure we use for this kind of reflection, and this one is called third conditional. Now, the third conditional is essential for talking about cognitive biases because it allows us to explore how different choices in the past could have led to different outcomes. It's the language of analyzing our mistakes and imagining a different past. Now, the structure looks a bit complicated, I know, but it's very logical. It has 2 parts, the if clause, which is the condition, and the main clause, which is the result. Now, we use the past perfect with the if clause, with the condition, and we use would have and past participle in the result. Now, let's break this down. The past perfect, this one is had plus the third form of the verb. For example, had seen, had known, had chosen, etc. This describes the unreal past condition. You will have to remember the condition is unreal. It didn't happen. And now for the result, would have plus past participle. This is would have plus the third form of the verb, like would have considered, would have saved, would have gone. Well, this describes the unreal past result. You'll have to remember, both these things, the condition and the result, never happened. That's why we call it a regret, right? Now, let's apply this to Sarah's story. Now, the original situation is that Sarah saw the documentary and became obsessed with Costa Rica. Now, let's use the third conditional reflection here. If Sarah hadn't seen the documentary, she would have considered other destinations. Hadn't seen is the past perfect here. See, if Sarah hadn't seen, we use the past perfect with the if clause or with the condition. And with the result, she would have considered other destinations. That's the structure we're using here. Would have and past participle, or the third form of the verb. See how that works? We're creating a hypothetical imaginary past. It never happened, but we're just talking about it hypothetically, maybe to regret or maybe just to contemplate our past options. Now let's try a few more looking at her biases. Now regarding the anchoring bias, if the first tour she had found had been cheaper, she would have had a more realistic budget in mind. We can say she wouldn't have thought the $2,000 tour was cheap if she hadn't been anchored to the higher price. Now let's try to use the third conditional to talk about the sunk cost fallacy in her story, in Sarah's story. If the flight had been refundable, she definitely would have gone to the wedding. Or we can say she would have made a more rational decision if she had ignored the $300 she had already spent. So you see how useful it is? I know sometimes when we talk about grammar, everybody goes like, "Yeah, come on. Grammar, we hate grammar." Yeah, I know most people hate grammar, but they have no idea why they're hating it. Maybe you hate it because it looks like a set of rules, but forget about it as a set of rules and think about it as a set of tools. Some tools we can use to convey a special meaning, to talk about something more precisely, more eloquently, or if nothing else, just to be more efficient in our speaking and our writing. Now let's do one more regarding the status quo bias. If Sarah had been more adventurous, she would have chosen one of the unique local hotels. She was not more adventurous, and she did not choose one of the unique local hotels. I want you to remember all the time, the third conditional is not about things that happened, it's actually about things that never happened and about results that never happened, okay? It's a powerful tool, my friends. It lets us step back, analyze our biased decisions, and learn from them. Now, you can use other modal verbs in the result clause if you want, like could have or might have, to show possibility instead of certainty. For example, you can say, if she had ignored the anchor price, she might have saved $500. She might have saved. If you say she would have saved, that's certainty. But if you just want to throw in a possibility instead, you can use might or could instead of would, right? And now it's your turn. Think for a moment. What's a small decision you made yesterday? Maybe what you had for lunch. Now think about it with the third conditional. If I had brought my lunch from home, I would have saved money. If I hadn't been in such a hurry, I might have eaten something healthier, etc. Now, of course, there are a lot of possibilities, and each one of you has certain details to add to this practice, but the most important thing is to practice it, because practicing is the key to unlocking sophisticated conversations about the past. And using the third conditional is one of those tools that you need to unlock those sophisticated conversations about the past. All right? That was our grammar section, my friends. It's a very small section, but I made it small on purpose because I don't want to overwhelm you with grammar all at once. Just a small piece of grammar. Just know about it, understand what it is, try to use it. That's the most important part, okay? Next, we're gonna move to our speaking skill section. We're gonna talk about practicing negotiation with the anchoring bias. That's coming next. Don't go anywhere. I'll be right back. All right, so let's move from grammar to a very practical skill. Now, we learned about the anchoring bias and how powerful that first number is. So how can we use this knowledge to our advantage instead of being a victim of it? The tip is simple but incredibly effective. In a negotiation, try to be the first person to make an offer. When you make the first offer, you set the anchor. You frame the entire conversation around your number. The other person is now forced to negotiate based on your starting point, not theirs. This gives you a huge psychological advantage. Now, let's imagine you're at a flea market and you see a vintage lamp you love. There's no price on it. The seller is waiting for you to ask. The ineffective approach would be like, you ask, how much for this lamp? The seller says, $100. That's the anchor. It's probably way too high, but now your brain is stuck on $100. Even if you negotiate down to $70, you feel like you got a deal. But you might have been able to get it for $40 or $30 or even less if you had started the conversation differently. So let's talk about the effective anchoring approach. You pick up the lamp, you look it over, and say with confidence, this is a lovely piece. I can offer you $35 for it. What have you just done? You've set the anchor at $35. The seller might be shocked. They might have been hoping for $80 or even more, but the conversation is now happening in the $30 to $50 range, not in the $80 to $100 range. They might counter with, I can't possibly do $35, but I could do $60. And you can negotiate from there, likely ending up somewhere around $45 or $50, a much better outcome. And now let me tell you about a couple of useful phrases for anchoring. You can use phrases like, my budget for this is around, and you name your budget, or I'd be willing to pay, and you name your price, or I could offer you something. These three phrases are very useful for haggling. Now, I know you might say you can't use that everywhere. Of course you can. But wherever you can, wherever there is negotiation involved, you can use these words. So give it a try next time you're in a situation where the price isn't fixed. It feels a little bold at first, I know, but the results can be amazing. You are now the master of the anchor. And that brings me to the writing challenge. And we're going to talk about the decision diary. Now, it's time to put all this knowledge together. Our writing challenge for this week is called the Decision Diary. Your mission is to become a detective of your own mind. I want you to think of a significant decision you've made recently. It could be a purchase you made, like a new phone or a pair of expensive shoes. It could be a decision about a trip, a new job, or even a relationship. Now, once you have your decision in mind, I want you to write 200 to 300 words analyzing your thought process. Now, here are some steps to guide you. First, set the scene. Briefly describe the decision you had to make and the context surrounding it. And second, trace your steps. What was the first piece of information you received? What alternatives did you consider? What were the key factors that swayed you? Third, identify the bias. Try to identify at least one of the 5 biases we discussed today: availability, anchoring, sunk cost, status quo, or survivorship that might have played a role. And the fourth step is to analyze its impact. How did this bias influence your final choice? Did it make you overestimate something, ignore a better option? And finally, reflect. Using the third conditional, reflect on what you might have done differently if you had been aware of the bias at the time. Now, let me give you a quick example. Last month, I decided to sign up for a new expensive gym. The decision was prompted by a targeted ad on social media showing incredible fit people working out there. Now, you see, here I'm talking about the availability heuristic. Now, let me continue. The gym's founder rate was $150 a month, but only if I signed up immediately. The price became my anchor. I briefly looked at my old, perfectly good $40 a month gym, but it now seemed inadequate. The main reason I signed up, though, was that I had already paid for a $50 trial session. I felt like I couldn't let that money go to waste. See, here we got the sunk cost fallacy. And now let's continue and let me use the third conditional. If I hadn't seen that flashy ad, I would have been perfectly happy with my old gym. And if I had ignored the sunk cost of the trial, I would have saved over $100 a month. That's just an example, of course. Of course, it never happened to me, but an example. And that's it, my friends. Try it. It's not just for the writing part of it, while the writing part is pretty strong, but it's a powerful exercise in self-awareness. It's not about judging yourself. It's about understanding yourself. Now, I would love for you to share your decision diary with me on my Patreon page if you want. And by the way, when I talk about my Patreon page, don't be alarmed. You can go there. You can subscribe for free. You don't have to pay. Unless you want to, of course. And when you pay, you get extra stuff, of course. But as a free member, you get a lot of things too as well. And one of these things is easy access to talk to each other, if you want. But anyway, that brings me to the end of our language focus section. We've added some powerful words to our vocabulary, mastered a grammar point for talking about the past, and learned a speaking skill that could save you money. So, my friends, the next time you make a snap decision, take a moment to ask yourself, is this choice truly rational, or is a hidden bias pulling the strings? Join me in the next episode as we move from the world of decision-making to the world of belief. We'll explore why we cling to ideas that confirm what we already think and how we can see meaningful patterns in complete randomness. It's a journey into how we build our own reality. And with that, we come to the end of our episode for today. This is the first episode in our themed week, Understanding Cognitive Biases. We still have 4 more episodes. Try not to miss those as well, because by the end of this week, you will have a very good grasp of what cognitive biases are. You will understand them a lot better, and maybe, just maybe, they will help you make better decisions in your life. Now, for the other episodes for this week, don't forget that you can listen to the entire topic for free. But as for the language section of each episode, it's going to be reserved to my subscribers on Apple Podcasts or Patreon. You can find the links in the description of the episode if you decide to subscribe. And that's it for today, my friends. Thank you very much for listening. I'm Danny, and this is another episode from English Plus Podcast. I'll see you in the next episode. Remember, never stop learning with English Plus Podcast.